To the outside world, the blocks of flats that included Jeffrey Dahmer's 213 apartment in Milwaukee symbolized nothing more than cheap housing and a place that offered safety and shelter. But you know what they say about skeletons in one's cupboard? Sadly, Dahmer, who inhabited the space, had lots of them. This was more than a haven for Dahmer. It was where his viciousness was unleashed without restrictions. Here are the shocking discoveries the FBI made inside Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment. The smell of death. The American police are trained to be able to handle any situation, and for most of their service years, they face several dangerous situations, as well as some of the most dastardly criminals. However, nothing could have prepared police officers on duty, Robert Routh and Rolf Mueller, for what they discovered at Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment 213 at 924 North 25th Street, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. At around 11:30 p.m. on July 22, 1991, the two officers were flagged down by a half-naked Tracy Edwards on the corner of North 25th Street. Edwards curiously bore a handcuff on his wrist and explained to the officers that a freak had kidnapped him and tried to kill him. Edwards was still visibly shaken from his close shave with death, but his story was compelling enough to convince the officers to follow him back to Dahmer's apartment to get some answers and at least retrieve the keys to the handcuffs. When the officers arrived at Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment, they were immediately greeted by the putrefying smell of flesh emanating from his room. However, Dahmer explained that the offensive smell came from pork chops he had received from his family that had gone bad because his fridge went off. This was the same excuse he had given to his neighbors in the months leading up to his arrest, after they had grown suspicious of Dahmer's activities and the constant offensive odor coming from his room. While speaking out about the awful experience in Reels's docuseries, Murder Made Me Famous, Jeffrey Dahmer, Dahmer's former neighbor Vernell Bass, recalled, "The smell was so bad to where it woke me up around midnight or so, and I went to our front door and I looked in the hallway, and that was the first time that I had ever seen death. I could actually see the stench." Although the neighbors found the smell of Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment repulsive, the serial killer had always had a weird obsession with the stench of decomposing flesh, an unhealthy habit that began during his childhood. Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Lionel Dahmer and Joyce Flint. The family later moved to Ohio, where locals soon began to make grisly discoveries around the home of the Dahmers. According to Dahmer's childhood neighbors, he developed a keen interest in dead animals from a very young age, starting with insects before quickly moving on to roadkill. In what became a disturbing daily trend, Dahmer and some of his street pals would go hunting for chipmunks, hogs, and other critters that had been run over on the roads of Bath Township. He would then bizarrely chop the dead animals into several pieces, which he stored in a series of jars at the back of his family home. In a chilling 1991 interview, one neighbor told the Arizona Republic he would collect these animals, dismember them, separate them by body parts, and put them in jars. The hut had tons and tons of jars of animals and pieces of animals, and he seemed to be fascinated by the decomposition. Around that time, there were also several reports of cats and dogs disappearing mysteriously. Unsurprisingly, many of the neighborhood kids had cause to believe that Dahmer was responsible for the disappearance of their pets, and a terrifying discovery of an animal burial ground to the side of Dahmer's home all but confirmed their suspicions. Dahmer even had the presence of mind to leave little crosses on the graves, which made the place even more creepy and sent chills down the spines of the street kids. To add to their horrors, many of his former neighbors also recounted seeing animals like frogs and cats impaled or staked to trees. According to some locals, there were other aspects of Dahmer's activities within the neighborhood that had striking similarities to cult worship, and even though it was extremely worrisome behavior for a teenage boy, no one ever expected it to evolve into something more sinister, not even his parents. It might come as a surprise to you, but Jeffrey Dahmer's parents were certainly not in the dark about their son's deadly passion. At just 10 years old, Dahmer left his dad stunned when he asked what would happen if he placed chicken bones in bleach. Lionel replied, "God, Jeff, this is strange. This is weird." It is hard to imagine what Jeffrey Dahmer's dad's answer to that question would have been beyond that. But one thing for sure is that it didn't put him off his bizarre obsession with animals, which led him to eventually kill his first victim, a hitchhiker, Stephen Hicks, in 1978. This unfortunate incident happened barely a month after Dahmer graduated from high school. Later in his early 20s, Dahmer was forced to move in with his paternal grandmother, Catherine Hughes, in a suburb of Wisconsin called West Allis on 2357 South 57th Street after being honorably discharged from the Army. However, this foul smell that had almost become synonymous with his life became an issue again whilst living with Catherine. But this time, Dahmer had graduated from experimenting on dead animals to killing young gay men he usually profiled and lured from local bars. After murdering the men, Dahmer proceeded to dismember their bodies in his grandmother's basement, which left a terrible smell. Although Catherine complained to Dahmer about the odor coming from her basement, it is believed that she wasn't aware of the heinous crimes being committed by her grandson just just underneath her home. Almost at wit's end with their son, Jeffrey Dahmer's parents had hoped that Catherine would be able to pull him out of his dark slide. Still, Dahmer found Grandma Catherine's home as the perfect setting for his gruesome killings. The serial killer later confessed to 4 murders while living with his grandmother. First, in 1987, he murdered Stephen Tuomi in a rented room at the Ambassador Hotel. He then concealed the body in a large suitcase and transported it to his grandmother's residence, where he proceeded to dismember the body in the basement. 74 Polaroids of his dismembered victims. For someone who earned the nicknames Milwaukee Cannibal and Milwaukee Monster, Jeffrey Dahmer was quite soft-spoken, and his gentle disposition was easily disarming. And while his weird behavior could be unhinging at times, nothing in particular ticked him off as a potential serial killer to most of the people who came in contact with him. Also, apart from the pungent stench in his room, everything seemed to be normal about Dahmer's apartment at first glance. This stance was corroborated by some of the witnesses who testified during Jeffrey Dahmer's trial, including the manager of the serial killer's apartment building and a carpet cleaner. During the trial, James Poets, the owner of the carpet cleaning company hired by Dahmer in November 1990 and June 1991, described the killer as rather quiet and a regular normal person. In his own testimony, Sopa Princewill, the EE manager of Dahmer's apartment building, pointed out how Dahmer's apartment was always well kept. He said, "His apartment was probably the neatest I had seen." Additionally, during a recent interview with the independent Ann E. Schwartz, who was the first journalist to break the story of the notorious killer, noted that there was nothing strange or suspicious about the apartment. She said, "I walked up to Dahmer's apartment and I kind of stuck my head in because you're a journalist, you want to know. I guess the thing that was strange was that it didn't look strange." This is perhaps the less controversial reason why nearly everyone seemed to accept Dahmer's explanation of the stench in his room, including the 2 officers who followed Edwards back to apartment 213. However, on that fateful day, things took an unexpected turn when Dahmer pointed the officers to a dresser in his room to recover the keys to the handcuffs attached to Edwards' hand. There, one of the officers, Mueller, noticed a knife peeping underneath Dahmer's bed, as well as an open dresser that contained Polaroid pictures showing his victims in various stages of dismemberment. The pictures were so terrifying that it made the reality of the magnitude of evil they had just unearthed quickly dawn on the officers. On seeing that the officers had discovered the Polaroids, Dahmer attempted to evade arrest, but he was swiftly overpowered by the officers and handcuffed. Nearly 80 Polaroid photos were recovered from Dahmer's apartment, and they chronicled his heinous crimes through the years. Several of the pictures captured Dahmer while he engaged in sexual acts with the bodies of some of his victims. Some other snaps featured naked, dismembered corpses caught in different poses. While it is a known fact that most serial killers always keep souvenirs from the scene of their crimes, Dahmer's Polaroids were a different class of evil. The serial killer later claimed he took the photos of his victims as some sort of memento to keep him company. Dahmer is also believed to have taken the pictures of his victims at various stages of the dismemberment so he could recollect each act afterward and relive the experience. At this point, Dahmer's explanation for the stench in his room had become suspicious, so once he had been secured by the officers, Mueller's attention immediately turned to the infamous refrigerator that was supposedly producing all the nasty smells. Once he opened the fridge, he came face to face with something more evil and sinister that he didn't realize when he screamed out in horror. Inside the fridge, he found the freshly severed head, alongside the hand and genitals of a man. Seeing that he was finally at the end of the road, Dahmer reportedly told Mueller, "For what I did, I should be dead." Already overwhelmed by the evidence they had uncovered in Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment, both officers would only come to understand the enormity of Dahmer's statement when further search was conducted by the Milwaukee Police's Criminal Investigation Bureau. The gruesome discoveries from apartment 213 shocked law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, and led to one of the greatest media circuses the country had ever seen, Jeffrey Dahmer's Instruments of Death. It was more like dismantling someone's museum than an actual crime scene. This was the statement made by the chief medical examiner, who led the team of law enforcement agents that tore through Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment in search of evidence of his heinous crimes. Alongside the chilling Polaroids, police also found sketches that showed Dahmer's intended plans to construct an altar in his apartment. What was even more shocking were the childlike drawings that showed exactly how Dahmer wanted to decorate the altar with his victims' skulls. In the sketch that showed the level of depravity in Dahmer's mind, 2 painted skeletons would stand on opposite sides of a long black table that is lined with decapitated human heads. During his interrogation, Dahmer confessed to making some of his victims pose for photos on a black table that was going to be part of his altar. It is safe to assume that some of the body parts of the men in those pictures would have become decorations on Dahmer's altar if he had not been apprehended. With a museum of evidence stacked against him, Dahmer opted to waive his rights to have a lawyer present during his interrogation. Defending his stance, Dahmer reportedly said, "I created this horror, and it only makes sense I do everything to put an end to it." For 2 weeks and a total of 60 hours, Dahmer took Detective Dennis Murphy and Detective Patrick Kennedy on a dark trip, detailing the last moments of his victims while also explaining the methodology and reason behind his senseless, despicable crimes. The interrogation also focused on making sense of the evidence collected at his apartment, which included Dahmer's tools such as a Sears Craftsman power drill, a selection of saw blades, a hypodermic needle, and a hammer. In his bathroom, investigators also found bottles of ether and chloroform. Historically, these chemicals have been administered as anesthesia to patients, and they became a weapon in Dahmer's hands, which he used to subdue his victims in preparation for his evil experiments. The Milwaukee Monster also spiked his guests' drinks with sleeping pills that rendered them completely helpless. On some occasions, Dahmer would wait until after a consensual sexual exchange had happened before proceeding to drug his victims. Other times, Dahmer would first drug his victims and then strangle them to death before having sex with their corpses. During his 60-hour confession, Dahmer revealed he had been consumed by his sexual desires, as well as his ultimate goal to create zombies or love slaves. While searching through Dahmer's apartment, investigators found samples of skull fragments with drill holes, which corroborated Dahmer's disturbing obsession with lobotomy. In his confession, Dahmer spoke at length of how he dreamed of having his victims completely compliant and nearly brain dead so he could keep them in his home to do everything he needed. To achieve this, Dahmer drilled a hole through the frontal lobes of his victims' brains and injected hydrochloric acid into them. Dahmer claimed the crude procedure worked at first, but then the victims later died. This was the same fate that befell Dahmer's youngest victim, 14-year-old Konorak Synthesumphone, when he crossed paths with the killer in the late hours of May 26, 1991. Desperate to help his family out financially, Konorak followed Dahmer to his apartment after he promised the boy payment for a photo shoot. Unbeknownst to Konorak, he was walking straight into a terrible nightmare that would eventually claim his life in the most gruesome manner. Perhaps the most heartbreaking part of Konorak Synthesumphony's story is that he nearly managed to get away. Despite being heavily sedated by Dahmer, Konorak managed to saunter out of apartment 213 and into the streets of Milwaukee. In the early hours of May 27, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer's neighbor Sandra Smith called the Milwaukee police to report that an Asian boy was running naked on the streets. According to court documents, Smith told the dispatcher, "I'm on 25th and State, and there is this young man. He's buck naked. He's been beaten up. He's really hurt. He needs some help." When the police arrived, they found the boy naked and bleeding just outside Dahmer's apartment building. All attempts to communicate with Konorak proved abortive, as he was largely incoherent and dazed. Unbeknownst to the policemen and witnesses, Dahmer had already begun the first phase of his deadly experiment on the boy when he was discovered on the streets. During his confession, Dahmer revealed he had already drilled a hole into Konorak's frontal lobe at that point and injected hydrochloric acid to induce a zombie-like state. Somehow Konorak had managed to escape when Dahmer stepped out of his apartment to buy some liquor. As the officers tried to make sense of the situation, Dahmer arrived on the scene and was able to convince the officer that Konorak was his 19-year-old homosexual lover who had simply had too much to drink. Despite the protests from the African-American women at the scene, including Smith and Nicole Childress, the officers escorted Konorak back to Dahmer's apartment. According to Dahmer, the officers clearly did not want to get entangled in a homosexual domestic disturbance case, and one of the officers merely peeked his head around in the bedroom, but didn't really take a good look. The two officers then told Dahmer to take care of the boy before leaving the scene, allowing the deranged killer to finish up his butcher job by administering a fatal dose of hydrochloric acid into Konorak's brain. If the police had been a bit more thorough in handling this particular incident and conducted even a basic search on Dahmer's apartment, they would have found the body of Dahmer's 12th victim, Tony Hughes, just laying in an adjoining room. What is particularly haunting about the Konorak story, especially for the Synthesumphone family, is the fact that Dahmer had been convicted of sexually assaulting Konorak's older brother Somsak using the same pretext of paying for a photo shoot in 1988. Despite receiving a lengthy sentence, Dahmer was released after spending only a year in prison. This has left many to believe that maybe Konorak would never have crossed paths with Dahmer if only the killer had been allowed to serve his full sentence in prison. Amongst the several ifs in Dahmer's story that somewhat allowed him to go undetected for so long is the fact that the police paid lip service to calls from Glenda Cleveland asking for a proper investigation of Dahmer. Cleveland was Sandra Smith's mom, and even though she was not present at the scene, she took particular interest in Konorak, repeatedly calling the police over the case only to be rebuffed. In one of her numerous phone calls to the Milwaukee Police Department, apartment, Cleveland can be heard asking the police to investigate Dahmer. Cleveland: yeah, what happened? I mean, my daughter and my niece witnessed what was going on. Was anything done about the situation? Do you need their names or information or anything from them? Officer: no, not at all. Cleveland: you don't? Officer: nope, it was an intoxicated boyfriend of another boyfriend. Cleveland: well, how old was this child? Officer: it wasn't a child, it was an adult. Cleveland: are you sure? Officer: yep. After discovering missing person posters for Conorak Synthesom phone, Cleveland's calls to the police and even the FBI only intensified. However, no one ever took her call. During this period, Dahmer was able to kill 5 more victims. Again, if police had taken Cleveland's suspicions more seriously, a simple background check would have helped police discover that Dahmer had served jail time for molesting Conorak Synthesom phone's older brother some years earlier. 11 human bodies, including body parts and skeleton. Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment was famously called a killing factory by authorities because of the unbelievable amount of tools that were found inside it. But for so many people, apartment 213 was more of an indoor graveyard due to the massive amounts of corpses and mutilated human parts that were recovered from the apartment. As per FBI records, the corpses of 11 people were recovered in the room, which included a torso and a bag of human parts frozen at the bottom of Dahmer's freezer, 2 human hearts, and a part of an arm stored in plastic bags on top of the refrigerator shelves. They also found 2 complete skeletons, 2 severed penises, a mummified scalp, a pair of severed hands, as well as 3 more torsos inside a blue 57-gallon drum. Finally, the investigators found 4 decapitated human heads in Dahmer's kitchen, a tray of blood drippings inside the refrigerator, and 7 skulls with some of them bleached or painted in Dahmer's bedroom and closet. Graveyards are one of the creepiest places for most people because of the fear of ghosts, and it is also a reminder of man's immortality. Strangely, neither of these applied to Jeffrey Dahmer, who saw himself as a custodian of mortality, or a makeshift grim reaper who dispatched his victims to the great beyond at will. And like every champion liked to display their trophies in special rooms, Dahmer preferred to have his victims very close to him, even going as far as eating some of them. Yes, Dahmer earned the nickname Milwaukee Cannibal after confessing to eating 2 people during his reign of terror. Dahmer claimed the first time he tried eating human flesh was simply out of curiosity, but subsequently it became compulsive. He further admitted that he cooked the bodies of his victims using salt and pepper and added condiments for flavor. From the evidence gathered by the investigators, most of the killings and experimenting on his victims' bodies took place in Dahmer's bedroom and kitchen. In his bedroom, investigators found a blood-stained wall that pointed to criminal activities taking place in the room. On further inspection, investigators discovered that the mattress in the room was soaked with blood. Dahmer also converted his dressers and closet into makeshift storage for various human parts, while the refrigerator served a similar purpose in the kitchen. On several occasions, the depraved killer had attributed the odor from his apartment to an unplugged freezer, but investigators quickly found that wasn't the case. In actuality, the freezer was used as a storage for the dismembered body parts of his victims, which he planned to either use for his altar or cook at will. Following the unusual discovery inside Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment, law enforcement authorities were faced with the uphill task of identifying the 11 bodies found inside the apartment. Although the bad state of the body parts made it nearly impossible for the bodies to be identified, the confessions of Jeffrey Dahmer alongside the personal IDs of the victims, which Dahmer kept as souvenirs, helped investigators identify all 17 men murdered by the serial killer. By his own confession, Dahmer's first murder, Stephen Hicks, took place in 1978 while he was still living in his parents' home in Ohio. It took another 9 years, September 1987, before Dahmer killed his second victim, Stephen Tuomi. The gruesome murder took place in a hotel room, but Dahmer always maintained that he doesn't have any recollection of how it happened. He told police that he only meant to drug and sexually assault the 24-year-old, but not kill him. According to police reports, Dahmer said he could not believe this had happened. Still, that didn't stop the Milwaukee Monster from hauling Tuomi's body in a suitcase to his grandmother's basement, where he masturbated on the corpse and disposed of the dismembered body parts. Strangely, he chose to keep Tuomi's head for several weeks after the murder. Dahmer later confessed that after his second killing, the monster in him was unleashed and he gave in to his dark desires completely. During a jailhouse interview in the early 90s, Dahmer said, "That's when the obsession went into full swing. After the second time, it seemed like the compulsion to do it was too strong, and I didn't even try to stop it after that. And it didn't take long for him to strike again, killing his third victim, Jamie Doxtator, on January 18, 1978. Over the next 3 years, Dahmer killed 14 more people in an unprecedented killing spree that shook the whole of America. As Dahmer progressed with his killings, a ritualistic undertone developed in his modus operandi, which involved the use of chemicals chemicals to dissolve his victims' bodies, and sometimes even eating human flesh. Dahmer also carried out crude lobotomies on some of his victims, including Errol Lindsay and Konarak Synthesomphone. The procedure involved Dahmer drilling a hole through the skull of his victims and injecting hydrochloric acid into the brain. Both cases proved unsuccessful, with the victims eventually dying, but that only increased Dahmer's thirst for more blood. 3 human torsos, dissolving in hydrochloric acid. Over the years, the world has come to know several serial killers, but what makes Jeffrey Dahmer stand out in the list is not actually the killing. It is what he chooses to do before and after taking the lives of his victims. Most of Jeffrey Dahmer's murders were calculated as he preferred to prey on victims on the fringes of society who were either given to crime or estranged from family, making their disappearance easily go under the radar, while also ensuring that Dahmer wasn't likely to get caught. Dahmer's modus operandi was to lure his victims to his apartment with the promise of money or sex. He then offers them drinks laced with drugs and proceeds to strangle them to death while they are unconscious. Aroused by the death of his victims, Dahmer engages in sex acts with the lifeless bodies. Additionally, he kept body parts and pictures showing the dismemberment process as souvenirs to help him relive the experience afterward. In some instances, Jeffrey Dahmer ate his victims, and his most popular monikers, the Milwaukee Cannibal and the Milwaukee Monster, were true reflections of the evil that he personified. Dahmer repeated these sequences of events for most of his murders, including his very first kill as an 18-year-old. At the time, Dahmer had just graduated from Revere High School and was temporarily living alone following the divorce of his parents. His mother had moved out of the family house with Jeffrey Dahmer's younger brother, David Dahmer, while his dad was staying in a motel nearby. The freedom and solitude allowed Dahmer to be completely consumed by his dark fantasies, which soon manifested in reality when he picked up 18-year-old hitchhiker Stephen Hicks in June 1978. The two teenagers returned to Dahmer's parents' house, where Dahmer proceeded to get Hicks drunk, and when the hitchhiker attempted to leave, Dahmer whacked him in the head with a barbell before strangling him to death. In a confessional, Dahmer explained the reason for his actions, saying, "I didn't want him to leave." Dahmer dismembered Hicks's corpse, wrapped the body parts in plastic parts, and buried them in the backyard of his parents' home. Dahmer later exhumed Hicks' remains and peeled off the flesh from the bones using acid. He then crushed the bones with a sledgehammer and tossed the residue across a wooded ravine. Fast forward to 1991, when Dahmer was finally caught and investigators began searching his apartment for evidence. Completely unaware of Dahmer's dark history and modus operandi, investigators were drawn to a 57-gallon blue drum inside Jeffrey Dahmer's bedroom. It was uncommon to see such a drum inside a bedroom, and what was even more striking about it was the unpleasant smell that seemed to be coming from inside the drum. When they opened the drum, the contents left everyone utterly appalled. Inside the drums were 3 human torsos dissolving in acid. Apart from the offensive stench coming from the drum, the gory sight of 3 torsos at various degrees of decomposition was a haunting sight. It was impossible to imagine how a human being would be so comfortable carrying out such evil experiments on a fellow man. But Dahmer was no ordinary human. He was a cold-blooded killer who existed only for his unholy pleasures. So, it wasn't that big of a surprise when the police later described Dahmer as emotionless while recounting the details of his heinous crimes. Putting it plainly, a Milwaukee police deputy chief said Dahmer's casual composure while talking about his victims as so relaxed it almost felt as if he was doing the simple task of pouring a cup of water. Talks about killing people just as if it's like pouring a glass of water. This wasn't so far from the truth. After killing for most, if not all of his adult life, death had become second nature to Dahmer, and he had also become a master at covering up his crimes. Once Dahmer was done dissolving the dismembered body parts in the drum filled with acid, he took out the bones and preserved them in formaldehyde. He then flushed the remaining contents of the drum down the toilet. Any fleshy body part that Dahmer chose not to dissolve in acid, he got rid of it by eating it. Cold, despicable, and genuinely evil. These are but a few words that aptly describe what Jeffrey Dahmer represented. Mueller, one of the police officers who arrested the killer in his apartment, reportedly said Dahmer gave him the creeps. This was a sentiment that was shared by several other police officers at the time, but not many of them were as open as Mueller to admit it publicly. And while Dahmer's arrest brought a lot of relief for Mueller, the same couldn't be said for John Balcerzak and Joseph Grabish, the two officers who responded to the distress call concerning Konarak Synthesomphone on May 27, 1991. As information regarding the nature of the killer's crimes became public, the Milwaukee Police Department was thrown into the spotlight for all the wrong reasons, making it impossible to overlook the culpability of the two officers in Konarak's death. Milwaukee Police Chief Philip Areola eventually fired the two officers for failing to discharge their duties properly. Areola faulted the officers for failing to positively ID Konarak, ignoring the witnesses' accounts and not calling their superiors for advice. The officers opted to challenge their dismissal, and they were later reinstated by a court order. Jeffrey Dahmer's trial began in January 1992, and even though he had confessed to the crimes during police interrogation, he initially pleaded not guilty. He later changed his plea to guilty, and his defense team tried to argue insanity as the reason for his terrible crimes. However, the jury didn't buy the defense's claims of insanity and found him guilty on all counts on February 15, 1992. He was subsequently sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison, with an additional 16th term in May of that year. Jeffrey Dahmer found it easy to adjust to prison life and seemed to turn a corner when he embraced Christianity and eventually got baptized by a local. However, death came sooner rather than later for Jeffrey Dahmer at the hands of his fellow prison inmate, Christopher Scarver, on November 28, 1994. Scarver brutally beat Dahmer to death with a metal bar in the prison weight room and claimed God told him to do it. Many years later, while speaking to the New York Post about why he killed Dahmer, Scarver claimed he not only found Dahmer's crimes disturbing, but was also irked by the killer's habit of taunting other inmates with limbs he had fashioned from the prison food. For more content like this, click on the videos showing on your screen now.